Hello student, how are you? Assalamu alaikum. Today we are going to discuss about the Phillips curve. Learning outcomes. After watching this video, you will be able to understand what is the Phillips curve and its applications. Origins of the Phillips curve. Phillips curve originated out of the analysis comparing money wage growth with the unemployment. The findings of the Arthur William Phillips, A.W. Phillips, in the relationship between unemployment and the rate of change of money wages in the United Kingdom 1861 to 1957 suggested there was an inverse correlation between the rate of change in money wages and unemployment. For example, a rise in unemployment was associated with the declining wage growth and vice versa. The Phillips curve is an economic concept developed by A.W. Phillips, stating that inflation and unemployment have a stable and inverse relationship. The theory claims that with economic growth comes inflation, which is in turn should lead to more jobs and less unemployment. The Phillips curve given by the A.W. Phillips shows that there exists an inverse relationship between the rate of unemployment and the rate of increase in the nominal wages. A lower rate of unemployment is associated with the higher wage rate or inflation and vice versa. In other words, there is a trade-off between wage inflation and unemployment. Reason: during boom, demand for labor increase due to the greater bargaining power of the trade union, and wages also increases. Here is the basic diagram of the Phillips curve. Look at on x-axis we take the unemployment rate and y-axis would take the inflation rate. There is a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. Look at inflation rate 2% at point A, inflation rate is 2% and unemployment rate is 6%. As inflation increases from 2 to 5% at point B, the unemployment rate decreases. This shows the inverse or negative relationship between unemployment and inflation, or trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Phillips curve suggests there is an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. This suggests the policy makers have a choice between the prioritizing inflation or unemployment. During the 1950s and 1960s, Phillips curve analysis suggested there was a trade-off and policymakers could use demand management to try and influence the rate of the economic growth and inflation. For example, if unemployment was high and inflation low, policymaker could stimulate aggregate demand. This would help to reduce the unemployment but cause a higher rate of inflation. Stagflation of 1970. 1970s, there seemed to be a breakdown in Phillips curve as we experience stagflation. Here we define the stagflation, a situation in which the higher unemployment and higher inflation. The Phillips curve was criticized by the monetarist economists who argued that there was no trade-off between unemployment and inflation in the long run. However, some feel that the Phillips curve has still some relevance and policy makers still need to consider the potential trade-off between unemployment and inflation. Here is the original Phillips curve, PC curve, which presented the AW author in his research article, the unemployment rate on x-axis and inflation rate in the percentage on the vertical axis, and there is a negative relationship between inflation and unemployment, that is the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. US unemployment and inflation. This analysis was later extended to look at the relationship between inflation and unemployment. Again, the 1950s and 60s showed there was evidence of this inverse trade-off between unemployment and inflation. US unemployment and inflation. Look at the data. The red line shows the unemployment and the blue line shows the inflation in terms of the CPI. Look at there is a trade-off between unemployment and inflation in different years, in 1987, 1990, and 2010. 2010. It shows there is a negative relationship between inflation and unemployment. There are occasions when you can see a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. For example, between 1979 and 1983, inflation CPI fell from 15 to 2.5%. During this period, we see a rise in unemployment from 5% to 11%. In 2008, the recession caused a sharp rise in unemployment and inflation became negative. Conclusion: if the economy is operating below full capacity, a significant increase in aggregate demand is likely to cause a reduction in unemployment and higher inflation. Most economists would agree that in short term, there can be a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. However, there is a disagreement whether this policy is valid for the long term.